Is your podcast growing slower than you'd like it to? Or maybe you saw some growth early on, but things have plateaued and your listener base has stagnated. If this resonates with you, then you need to listen to this episode. Anthony Nwaneri and Taig O'Shea host Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, and each week they help podcasters discover the reasons behind why their podcast isn't growing as fast as they'd like. They've coached many podcaster clients as well, helping one podcaster double her listener base in just 60 days. And in this episode, you'll discover the 5 mistakes almost every podcaster is making, title and show notes secrets to get your episodes discovered, how to craft a podcast that keeps people listening, are AI tools helping or harming podcasters, what elements of your podcast should you fix first, and so much more. If your podcast has plateaued or is growing slower than you'd like, then this episode is for you. Anthony Nwaneri and Taig O'Shea, thank you for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. How are you doing?
Very well, Joe. Thank you for having us on.
You're very
Doing
welcome.
awesome, doing very awesome. I'm excited for this episode, to be fair.
Cool. So I thought we could jump right into it and get our listeners some value. I wanted to ask you about what mistakes podcasters are making when it comes to growing their show. So we're thinking along the lines of podcasters. They may have been podcasting for 6 months or so, or maybe a year. They're seeing a little bit of growth, but it's kind of plateaued, or it's just not growing as fast as they would like. Do you have like 5 mistakes that almost every podcaster tends to make in terms of growing their show?
Yeah, definitely. Probably a lot more than 5 actually, but I'm sure we can slim it down. Let's trade off, Anthony. So I can start with most podcasters focus on getting more exposure when actually most podcasts don't have a problem with their exposure. And when I say exposure, I mean, getting in front of new potential listeners, like social media, being a guest on other podcasts, having big guests come to your show, like that kind of stuff. When actually the problem really lies with keeping listeners around once they're in. There are actually more listeners finding podcasts, even small ones, than most people think, but download numbers fluctuate, or maybe download numbers go down month after month because those listeners are coming and then they're leaving again and they're not sticking around. So any kind of exposure, any kind of social media, that kind of thing, it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in, And where really the root of the issue that we find for most of our clients and for most podcasters is in retention. So seeing how long people are listening, making sure you get the same people coming back for more. That's really where it all starts, because then that's a strong foundation. And then you can grow from there. And then you can add things like social media.
Spot on. I mean, mistake number 2 that I would say would be entrepreneurs of podcasts, whether that's beginners, new experience, it doesn't really matter. Podcasters overall, believing that the days where you can just create a solo show or a interview-based show and have a guest on, and the show will magically have listeners turn up without having something that's different and unique about your show are long gone. If you aren't someone who's a celebrity or who already has an audience built out, it's so important nowadays because competition is at all-time high. Everyone's got a podcast, and their dog and their mum. So I think it's so important nowadays that oftentimes people overlook the importance of, hey, I want to make a podcast about, let's say, business. How can I do this in a different way? What right now within the podcasting space is missing, and how can I be the person to fill that gap in my show? No one does that. No one thinks about it like that. Everyone just thinks I want to talk about X, Y, and Z, but don't think about how they are uniquely positioned versus everyone else who's trying to do the exact same thing. That's mistake number 2.
Yeah, I can see that those two link really nicely together, I think. Like, just thinking about the actual content, are you delivering what people want before you start thinking about all these other things that we're probably going to talk about in terms of getting it in front of people?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a big thing I think people gloss over, just having like a bog standard, say, like weekly interview. But if it's in a crowded niche where that's already been done, it makes it a lot harder to grow. So that just how you deliver the content is huge. Let's see, number 3, not applying or not paying any attention to podcast SEO. This has been a game changer for us and our clients, and it's kind of painful how easy it is to do it, and it doesn't take that much time either. It's not really something you have to spend hours on, or honestly, even you can spend like 5 or 10 minutes on it each week. and get amazing, amazing results from people that are actually looking for podcasts. Because this means, I'm not talking about Google or websites or blogs or anything like that. Podcast SEO, strictly ranking your show higher on Apple and Spotify. And it's a combination of factors. And going back to the retention piece, that matters as well. Because, if you have amazing keywords and you're on page one of Spotify, but people are only listening to a minute, then that's not going to help. But when I say podcast SEO, this starts with including keywords in your title, your show name, your show description, this kind of thing. So like for us with our podcast, why your podcast isn't growing, we make sure to have the words podcast growth and podcast and grow your show, and all those kind of phrases populate a lot. And we've actually had a lot of listeners say that they found us because they were searching for a show like us on Apple and we came up. That's one of the best ways to meet the audience where they're at when they're actually looking. Again, in comparison with social media, people are not really looking at that moment in time, right? They're kind of just like doom scrolling. So it's a lot harder to convert someone than it is if you just be in front of them when they're looking on Apple. So yeah, that would be a podcast SEO.
Yeah, nice one. Yeah, I think we can go into that a little bit more later on if you don't mind.
And then, of course, we have mistake number 4. Now, this one to me is really, this is more about the show notes, right? I think everyone has show notes, show descriptions to describe a particular episode. Now, most people are going to spend their time talking about their guests or overly emphasizing their credentials or giving tons of information about what might have been spoken about on the podcast. Our approach, or rather the mistake here, is not treating your show notes as a sales pitch, and instead treating your show notes as almost like just a billboard of information for everyone to have a look at, rather than a sales pitch for the listener you're trying to attract to read, keep engaged, and to convince them to click and listen to the episode. The mistake is not seeing the show notes as a funnel straight to the podcast. And I think that's a huge one that people just honestly just often overlook, because again, it's like a set and forget. You're so stuck in a routine of like maybe get ChatGPT to make you a show notes, or maybe just get like an assistant to make your show notes, or maybe you just want to make a super information, or you're a bit lazy with it and don't really have a process and don't know if what you're doing is working or not. Whereas for us, it's really important that we know like, hey, that's an activation point, meaning that's a piece of our podcast a new listener will engage with, and that will determine whether they decide to listen to it or not. So how do we make it into a pitch? How do we get them to click and listen? And that's kind of a mistake that I think people often make, which is not doing that.
Cool, thanks for that. And we've got one more.
So number 5 would be not creating content that makes the show bingeable. And when I say bingeable content, I'm talking about your episodes as a collective rather than individual episodes. I think before I just mentioned retention time, and if listeners are only listening to 1 minute out of your 10-minute episode, then obviously that tells Apple your show is bad, right? But that's kind of like the micro. That's on the smaller scale. That's within the episode. But then on the larger scale, it's like, are you getting the same listeners listening to every episode? Or does a new listener find your podcast? Maybe one episode is good for them and really relevant, but then the next one's just not up their street and it's not what they need right now. So then they just don't end up listening week to week. And again, this comes back to then it's like the leaky bucket thing, right? You're not keeping the same people around and not building a strong base and not getting people coming back for more. And the way we do this anyway with our clients is through bingeable content. So making sure every single episode links to the next one. It's not necessarily like a follow-on story or anything like that, but every episode in tandem is all about the things that are relevant to a certain listener right now, so that when they find the show, they're like, wow, like I could binge this right now because all of these last 6 episodes are right up my street and it would be super useful to me. And that's really how you create, well, again, a bingeable show, and that keeps people around.
Love it. Cool. Thanks, Taig. Thanks, Anthony. I think that in itself, those 5 mistakes, that's already a lot to think about, that could start getting listeners to grow faster. But I think if we go into a little bit more detail, make those a little bit more actionable. Taig, you mentioned about podcast SEO, and I have noticed, some of the tactics that you've used in terms of the title, because I think some some people are concerned that it might be considered like keyword stuffing, or it might make things unclear if they start, if they put the name of their podcast as the title and then stick a load of keywords after that. And in another case, I've seen podcasters, they'll have their podcast will be named the exact same thing as another existing podcast, and I feel like that could be a bit of an issue in terms of SEO. Can you speak to those things and how podcasters should be titling their podcast, as in the name of the podcast itself, to get in a couple of keywords and get some value out of that tip?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something that can be done in a lot of different ways. And I think, firstly, to your point about kind of using a show name that already exists, yeah, that's never a good idea, right? Particularly if the show is still active. If it's a show that hasn't released in years, personally, I wouldn't say against it, but obviously you want an original show name. The way we do it with our clients and the way we've done it for ourselves is we kind of take like a title subtitle format. So we might have a short, catchy, a couple of words, and then we might have a longer subtitle that includes some keywords. And I think maybe to your point about people might get concerned about keyword stuffing, and maybe it doesn't read as well, or maybe it's, I don't know, playing the game or anything like that. The idea of a subtitle and how we look at it isn't to just put a load of keywords in there in a way that doesn't read well and doesn't entice the listener. It's to bake in keywords to a short phrase that clearly communicates what the podcast is for. So let's take I won't use our podcast because it gets a bit confusing when we're talking about a podcast about podcasting, right? So let's say like a meditation show.
Yeah.
And we're trying to rank that. And people might be, and let's say we're targeting people who specifically they're really anxious and they are just getting into meditation, right? So you might think about what would they be looking for if they were looking for content about this? Well, they might type in meditation. They might type in reduce anxiety or stop anxiety or whatever. Let's go with reduce anxiety. They might go meditation for beginners or starting meditation, right? These are just some ideas. And of course we could go on. So what I would see and think that's keyword stuffing is if we just call the show, say, the meditation guide, meditation for beginners, anxiety, solve your problems, come out of depression, guided meditation and breathing exercises, like just a long stringy thing like that. That's kind of just separate words that doesn't have any flow between them, right? I think if you saw that on paper, hopefully this is coming across to people listening because I'm just explaining it. I'm quite a visual person with this kind of stuff. Then if you saw that kind of thing, it might just look, again, a bit long, a bit clunky, and a bit maybe obvious, depending how aware you are, that you're just stuffing in a bunch of words for the sake of it. But how we like to do it is to really think about what does the listener want, the ideal listener, and form a subtitle around that first, and then tweak it to incorporate keywords. So again, we might think meditation podcast, the person coming is a beginner and they're looking to reduce anxiety through meditation. So a subtitle that just says what that is might be something like a beginner's guide to reducing anxiety through meditation. And that way we say what the podcast is and we communicate the value of it, i.e. reduce anxiety, but we also get in those keywords, right? So we have reduce anxiety, we have beginners, which is another one as well. And that way we can kind of marry the two. So I guess to wrap up, the aim of the podcast name is obviously you want the first couple of words to be something that feels exciting for you, maybe something catchy or something clever. I think a lot of people do it that way. But I think the bit that often podcasters miss is considering an extended subtitle that really communicates the benefits of listening to the show in a way that naturally incorporates words they might be using when they're looking for a show like that. But does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And then just as another example for the listener, in case I haven't mentioned it already, so your podcast, Anthony and Taig's podcast, is Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. Then there's a colon, the guide for entrepreneurs to grow fast and monetize. So there's an extra couple of keywords in there for people, searching for how to grow fast and so on, how to monetize your podcast. I'm presuming that's the idea around it.
That's it. Yeah. And the important thing about that as well, this is a bit of a bonus that comes with being a bit more descriptive, is by adding that to your show name or your episode title, and wherever you add that, there's little extra bits. it helps further qualify, or rather it helps clarify who the show is for, meaning that when someone does find your show, like, they feel like it's for them. It's not just, for example, a meditation podcast about, just meditation. It's like, no, for those struggling with anxiety. You could have a different one as a meditation podcast for those struggling with insomnia or sleep. And those are still keywords you can have in your show name or episode titles, but it's now helping you again differentiate in search. It's helping you be seen by the people who you should be seen by. And that way you're able to stand out and be clicked on over the competition, because your episode is now made more relevant to the individual who's looking for your content. Because SEO is not just about ranking high on Apple and Spotify and being discovered. It's about also being seen and clicked on by the right listeners, not just by everyone and anyone, by the right listeners. Adding those additional keywords and adding context around it is so important. Hence why keyword stuffing doesn't really work. It just looks a bit ugly. It feels very forced, and no one really knows what the podcast episode is about.
And just to follow on there, keyword stuffing without thought about what's going to actually appeal someone to click once they see that, it operates on the assumption that just including keywords gets you more downloads and more people listening. It might get more people to see the podcast, but they still need to choose that over the other 9 on the page, right? So they still need to click on that as well, which is why, again, we want to craft a subtitle with the primary reason being actually speak to what the listener wants. And as a secondary purpose, it's and include some keywords by way of doing that. If you see 3 shows and it's meditation 101, meditation for beginners, and the other is meditation unleashed, reduce anxiety for beginners, then of course that one is actually just a lot more clear what it's about, as well as having the keyword benefit.
And with your clients and with your own podcast, has there been any kind of obvious result where you've added this subtitle to the name of the podcast and then you've seen more organic growth, or you've seen the downloads increase soon after that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had this lady called Raven, and she was one of our very first few clients, working with for a little while, and she was on the verge of essentially quitting her podcast. She'd been trying to post on social media. She'd been trying to create promotional clips. She'd been trying to be everywhere because that's what she was told, and that's kind of what most podcasters believe is going to help them grow. And at this point, she'd been doing it for 2 years, and she would never, ever, ever, no matter what she'd done, she would never break past 400 downloads per month, but she would never go below 200 per month as well. And she was just stuck at this range for the longest time. Now, for you, that might be 1,000 that you never go above, and it might be 700 you never go below. But people tend to bounce between this range and oscillate and never break past that quote unquote slow and steady growth. And that's exactly where she was. And it wasn't until we fixed her SEO and we changed her title and her show name to be way more specific. So before it was I think it was Empaths Rising, or was it Empaths Rising? I think it was Empaths Rising. And then she switched from that to Empaths and Narcissists, helping people recover from PTSD and past trauma. So it became way more specific, had way more keywords. And that honestly helped her go from, strong to hit 400 downloads per month to now 23,000 monthly downloads 11 months later. Soon after that, she would then actually cross 30,000 monthly downloads. Now, the important thing here is, yes, the keywords helped a ton because she was now ranking for the right keywords. And yes, the change we made when it comes to clarifying who the show is for further helped her stand out so that she is clicked on over everyone else. But again, it's really important to note that Apple and Spotify, aren't going to be duped by, 2 young British guy over from the UK changing a bunch of keywords and having people's podcasts blow up. It's also extremely important to know that the content creators themselves, the content they make, plays a huge role in people coming back for more, people binging the content. So we don't view podcast SEO is an extremely powerful tool once you have all the other pieces in place, i.e. turning a stranger into a listener once they find your show on Apple and Spotify, engaging them, so having high retention time when they listen to your episode, and then having them coming back for more for future episodes based on your content strategy being on point. Because if you can't do that, if you can't get those listeners coming back for more, it doesn't matter what level of exposure, whether that's on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, if you become a guest on Joe Rogan, or whether that's you being page one of every single person's app on Apple and Spotify. If you can't get those listeners coming back for more, that exposure doesn't matter. So I really want to stress the point of like, I don't want to sit here and be like, yeah, just do the SEO and it's going to blow up. And that has happened, but only because these other pieces were in place.
Yeah, I guess it's like a hierarchy, isn't it? So if we think of all the elements of a podcast, you got the cover art, the name, as we've been talking about, the episode titles, the show notes, the content itself, if it resonates with the ideal listener, the consistency that it's released. If you were thinking about all of those elements in a hierarchy, what order would you say you'd put them in? So number one, most important thing would be, what would you say?
Damn, that's a great question, by the way.
That was a good question.
I think, well, number one always does have to be the content, because again, if you really just boil it down to what it is at core, it doesn't matter how you polish this thing, what keywords you have, how much the cover art stands on the page. If people are coming and going, then the show still won't go anywhere. So definitely the content is number one.
Yeah.
If we're getting into the content, we could talk about like how you deliver it. Again, is it an interview format that's been done? Is it a completely new way of doing it? And things like your intros, how you incentivize people to actually stick around till the end. I think another mistake I think podcasters make is maybe assuming that people just click on a show and then think, yep, 40 minutes, I'm sold. Actually, you really need to incentivize them to keep listening in the first couple of minutes. So all those pieces, but if we just say like the umbrella like of content, that would definitely come first. Anthony, what would you put after?
So I put you on the spot here, sorry. We've got
I would say, no, this is good. This is brilliant. I'd rather you make us think,
Yeah, for sure.
So I think in terms of the second thing that I would look at, I would then say that it would actually be how the show is packaged. So I'm going to group these elements because they're kind of all part of the same thing. So the packaging, meaning how is the podcast presented in a way to motivate a stranger or the listener you want to reach to actually engage with the podcast in the first place, which to me would be the show name, the cover art, episode title, and show notes. I think those would actually be kind of like the packaging. That's the thing that people see on the exterior before they click play. That would generally be the second thing. What order do they go in? If I had to get a bit more, if I had to nerd out a little bit here, I would say the episode titles, I would then say the show notes, and then I would say the show name. And again, you can have a mix of, no, sorry.
Hang on, we're going to debate you here. You would say show notes over the show name?
I would say yes, I would say so, yeah.
Really? Damn, that's controversial.
Yeah, the reason why I say it is because, like, I feel like there's shows out there, and like both indie and whatnot, where the episode titles are so good that people still listen to it, even though the show name has nothing to do with it. The show name becomes synonymous with the content and with episode titles, which attracts people there in the first place. And then the show name has its credibility because the content and the episodes and content strategy is built on top of that. So like that's kind of why I would debate. But again, it's subjective. But the point is, the second piece would be the packaging of how it's presented to a new audience.
Yeah.
So not even exposure, not even social media, not even like guesting, none of that. Like, because none of that matters if you can't turn that stranger into a listener and have them listen to your amazing content.
Yeah.
As opposed to really dumbing it down, like basically what we've said is number one, the actual content, like the audio, basically the quality of the audio file itself in the conversation, how the person is, what they're talking about. But then secondly, how that is presented. So like the cover, the title, all of that stuff, definitely top two. And then after that would be exposure. So how you get external exposure, which for us would be existing audiences, for example, being a guest on another podcast, over things like social media. But really those top two are like so far up above everything else, I would say. You can really grow a good show just with those two. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about like the order of title and
show name and so on? Because I guess part of it, I know it's obviously the question I asked. It's not like this is correct and this isn't or whatever. It's it could depend on the app you're on, I suppose. It just made me think because I've been looking at Spotify recently, and it's now got this episodes for you thing, and it's showing me episodes from random podcasts that I've never heard of before, and I don't really remember what the podcast name is on them because I'm not searching and I'm not looking at them compared to other podcasts. But if there was a title that had that clearly was going to solve a problem I had, I might consider clicking that and going through to the podcast. But then that's quite a specifically Spotify thing. But ultimately, obviously, you want to get it all right, so that it's performing as well as possible on all platforms.
Yeah, no, agreed.
And yeah, Anthony, you were talking about show notes as well. That was one of your points. There is, like you say, a lot of podcasters who will open their show notes with, in this episode, we're talking to such and such. He's the CEO of such and such company. He's an author of 2 books. He's won these awards, and then like they've stopped reading by then. So how would you say that people should be writing their show notes, and in order to persuade people to click through?
I love that. I think first things first, we can go about this 2 ways. The lazy way, which is kind of like, hey, it doesn't really matter. Let's just write some information, put it out there, see what sticks. Or we can go about it the more scientific way. And, for the business that we're in, when it comes to marketing, there's, of course, principles within direct response marketing, which is the whole idea of essentially being able to craft a piece of messaging or a piece of copy in order to motivate a specific action. And it's a science. It's not like a random thing. Like, people don't take actions randomly. Someone doesn't just discover your podcast and decide to listen to it for no random reason. There's a reason. So I think understanding that as a principle and just as a premise to begin with, that your audience that you want to reach are going to listen for a very specific reason. And we are able to actually influence their willingness, or rather, we can actually build up a desire within a stranger who is your ideal listener to click and listen. Or we can actually build like a repulsion where they read our show notes and they're like, actually, I don't really care about this podcast. Which oftentimes happens when you don't have a framework you're using to intentionally turn that stranger reading your content or show notes into a listener. So what I want to go over right now would be the actual principle that we follow, which is, or rather the copywriting framework we follow, which is AIDA. So attention. Always start your show notes by grabbing the attention of your ideal audience, by calling out a pain point, or by painting a picture of what they might desire, maybe even a shameful desire, and it could be something along the lines of, do you sometimes look at other podcasts in your industry and envy the growth that they've been having? That would be a hook, right? It kind of catches them where they're at. Like something that they might not admit to their friends or family, but it catches them where they're at. So that's the attention. Then you can go into attention, interest. Yeah, attention, interest, desire, outcome, AIDA. Then we move into interest. So now I have to build interest around this topic. What if I told you that 75% of podcasts end up giving up, quitting, and never making it because they didn't understand this one hidden principle about an element that most podcasters overlook? Most podcasters have slow growth, low engagements, and are making no money with their podcast, even after creating amazing content and interviewing the best quality guests. But why is that? And I could have a question mark. So now I'm building interest, like, whoa, what the hell? And now the desire part is really like, in order for someone to engage with your podcast, they need to have a desire in the first place. Like, for example, like the reason why just sharing your guest credentials means absolutely nothing to a stranger won't help the stranger decide to listen to your show is because they need to have a desire in the first place to even want to care about this guest. if they have no desire about caring about this guest, why would they listen to the show? So we have to build desire first. So attention, then build interest, then build desire. And desire could be something along the lines of, what if there was a way for you to promote your podcast less but still get more growth? What if there was a way that you could have, what if there's a way for you to turn your podcast show notes into a 24/7, salesman who's pitching all day and night and turning total strangers into listeners without you having to be there, whether you're asleep or whether you're awake? And what if there was a way for you to finally attract more of the right listeners, not only who will engage, but listen all the way to the end of the episode, hear your call to action, and finally make an investment in your program? If that sounds something that would be interesting to you, that's why you need to listen to our episode with Joe, who we have on our podcast right now, where we break down those exact things. So scroll up and click, and that'll be the call to action. So you see, like, that's a very different approach of how we are creating a show note with the intention of turning a stranger into listener. Grab their attention, build interest around the topic, build a desire for them to even want to listen to the show in the first place, and then end with a call to action. And yes, that was off the cuff and not planned.
Love it. I want to listen. I want to listen to this episode that you're describing, because, yeah, it's hooked me. I've got the desire. Okay. Yeah. I mean, if the listeners have a think about that, have a read of their show notes, and think, are they building that desire in the same way that Anthony just demonstrated, and that interest and grabbing that attention? And I guess that attention grabber, it requires you to really know your ideal listener and what's going to grab their attention, which you obviously do with that, how you open that one. Cool. Okay. Changing things up a little bit, I just want to touch on a few things that I know a lot of podcasters and a lot of our clients have been thinking about, and just getting some clarity around that. There's obviously been a lot of AI tools that have come out recently, and I think some podcasters, if they're not kind of sure exactly what a good title and a good show notes should look and sound like you've just demonstrated, they might see these AI tools like what Riverside can do, and ChatGPT and so on, and think, right, generate me a title, generate me some show notes, and think that that's suitable. Do you have any opinions on using these AI tools? Do you think they're worth it in any way, using them like to any degree, or do you not consider them yet?
That's another great question. For me, most of them, no. And it would be so ignorant to say, like, yeah, AI is just, there's nothing good out there. Like, all these tools are like a scam or like anything like that, because it's getting better all the time, right?
Of course.
And there definitely are some good tools out there. But I think I would say, definitely over half of the tools that I've seen people use, whether that's to create show notes or titles and that kind of thing, I think the output is pretty mediocre, I would say. If you're measuring it on the scale of how much does it sell the episode to someone, on the assumption that person is a stranger that doesn't yet care about the podcaster, So with the show notes, Anthony, that was really a good example, because a lot of the AI show note stuff that we've seen, it's very just like descriptive, informative, and it'll just basically repurpose the guest bio and say about how many kids they've got and all this stuff in the description. But it doesn't. That's on the assumption that, again, people want to read that and care about that, when actually most people don't. So I think they're good for saving time. I don't think I think more times than not, they're not good for selling the listen. And I think they can be used to help, but I think it's not going to get the podcaster the best result of growing their show if they just rely on that and allow themselves to kind of switch off from the creative process of titles and get basically use that as a reason to get complacent and not check over the titles and not read the show notes and the titles with an eye, thinking from the perspective of an ideal listener. An AI title, it might just scan the conversation with a guest and say, beating burnout with Taig O'Shea. And it depends how many titles you've seen, right? Because to some people, they might think, well, this is good. It says what the topic is. But again, that's very just descriptive and basic when really you could take that a whole load a step further. If you know the audience is podcasters beating burnout, you might want to get way more specific. How to re-energize and show up every week, even when you're running a busy podcast with a three-person team. Three-person team, you probably wouldn't get that specific, right? But again, the point is good episode titles can really specify and personalize to who the listener is for. Good show notes can really sell as if it's a total stranger. I don't think most AI tools do that yet. That said, I'm always curious because again, they are getting better and there are some good ones. So I don't want to like hate on them totally, but that would be in my opinion anyway.
Cool. Any thoughts, Anthony?
Yeah, I think I echo what Tyke's saying. I think the caveat to what we're saying would just be like, are most of the show notes that are done by AI better than an average podcaster who's being lazy with their show notes and can't be asked to take the time to write it? Yes. I would say that that is worthwhile because it's going to save them time, it's going to save them effort. If they're going to be lazy with it, they might as well be lazy with it in a productive way with AI. But is it the best approach if you're really trying to build a highly engaged audience, turn more strangers to listeners, have those listeners coming back for more, and have a more profitable podcast? No, it's not. And it's not at the point just yet where it can beat, let's say, the best show notes out there versus, the best AI tool versus like the best copywriter. The copywriter is still going to win, more times than not because of that human element, that depth. But it depends what you're optimizing for. For our clients and what we believe in, we believe that you need to put your best foot forward and present your best self every opportunity you get with a total stranger who's about to check out your show. Episode title, show notes, emails, content strategy, podcast, every single piece needs to be the highest quality in order to get to where you're trying to get to. So for us, we wouldn't advise that to our clients. We'd always say, hey, always make tweaks for yourself and take the time to do it because it's going to be worth it in the long run. But if that's not you, if that's not like the kind of vibe that you mess with, you're trying to get an episode out, trying to just put it out there, then great, go for it. But we wouldn't advise it or encourage it for our clients.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think with these AI tools that have come up and then the combination of that with people seeing how much other podcasters are doing, like they'll see they're doing video now every week, they're doing 3 shorts, they're doing whatever, an hour-long interview every week, and they're thinking right, I need to do all that as well. And now these AI tools have come out, I can do all of that. I can get it to rustle up a title, rustle up some show notes, I can use this AI tool to cut out 3 shorts and stuff. But then if they're using AI and kind of half-arsing every aspect of it, would they maybe be better off just doing audio only, 20-minute episode, show notes, title, but making it all amazing and targeted to their ideal listener, rather than trying to do, if he can't manage an hour long, he can't manage all this extra stuff, maybe it's just not worth doing. Don't know if that's along the lines of what you're thinking.
Yeah, Jared, that was
definitely
brilliant.
Yeah, there's a trade-off, right? Like you say. So yeah, you can definitely save a bunch of time with it. But like Anthony said, depends what you're optimizing for. And of course, you could just take that to the extreme and say, well, in that case, I'm just going to release a podcast once a month because then that'll just be like the best of all the interviews I've done that month and I can really focus on it. And obviously that's, well, maybe not obviously. For us, we wouldn't advise clients to do that because it's very hard to grow when you're only releasing monthly. You need to be really in your listeners' heads at least weekly to build up momentum on your side without fighting an uphill battle. But at the same time, if it's, if you have to just automate everything and kind of not even get time to check over things and it's rushed and you're not putting your best foot forward, maybe not. So again, it's really finding the balance. And I will say for podcasters that are focusing on growing, I think another thing we believe is that, well, you have to put the time that it's worth into it. You can't expect to grow just by running a weekly podcast. If you're feeling like that weekly podcast, you barely have time to maintain it, like you just chuck together the AI show notes and the title, because if you want it to grow, you have to put your attention there, right?
Yeah. And speaking of for AI and all that extra content and everything, just so you don't have to repeat yourself, just to explain to the listener, Taig and Anthony did an experiment recently where for 30 days they were sharing short form video content for their podcast across various social media platforms. And you found, if I recall correctly, you found that it didn't really make a huge amount of difference. Is that right? In terms of inbound?
Anthony can tell you the stats if you have them on off memory. Anyway,
I do not have them off memory.
Okay, sorry, I put you on the spot there. So it didn't do anything basically, and we posted shorts every single day on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and
LinkedIn.
we did use and LinkedIn, and we did use an AI tool to do them. And I'll be honest, some of those shorts I didn't even know we were going to use the video, so the camera was not necessarily optimized and things like that. And so you could say, yeah, well, we could have put more focus into that, but actually that's probably that's a similar amount of focus that most podcasters give it. It is just an AI tool, just kind of repurpose it to every platform without much thought. And so by emulating what the average podcaster does with short form content, yeah, we did find that it didn't do anything basically. It got, I think, what was Anthony? It got around 10,000 views total across all platforms.
Yeah.
Something like 200 clicks.
Yeah.
Something like 20 downloads.
Yeah.
I say something like, because again, it was off the top of my head, but it was something like that.
Yeah, I did actually write this down, and yeah, I wrote it down while I was listening. So it's 221 click-throughs, 2% increase in listeners, only 0.2% increase in listeners on the episodes you were promoting.
Yeah.
Thank you for pulling up those stats. Yeah, there we go.
Which of course is just like, again, is a simulation of what the average podcaster does. And with that being said, it makes sense why you would think that. But just practically speaking, I always ask any podcaster ever, so far, what's the one strategy you've consistently used to try and grow your show? Everyone says promoting on social media. And then you ask them, okay, has that helped you consistently month after month to grow your show? Silence. Like, so everyone knows it. It's like this weird thing that everyone knows, but no one ever like admits. And you'd be like, yeah, you're right. Actually, I should probably think of a different strategy. But as a one strategy that everyone consistently uses, but everyone also knows that no one gets results for it. It's just this weird thing. So yeah, we even did an interview. We interviewed 100+ podcasters. The number one strategy that was being used was social media.
Yeah.
But then the number one thing that everyone said was they felt like they were screaming to the empty void, and they didn't feel like it was really working.
Yeah, because it's true what you say. Like, and it links back to the AI thing where you're just kind of churning out AI
Content,
shorts and not really tracking what it's doing. I think is understanding exactly what you're getting out of it. Like, even though you only got a couple of hundred listens, those 10,000 views, like if a podcaster can really understand what benefit they are getting out of it, like we put shorts together for people, and we pick them, hand picked, and they've got graphics and sounds and all that kind of thing, so they tend to perform quite well. But I do say to our clients, like, a lot of the benefit you're getting out of these isn't from click-throughs. It's for lead nurture. It's to show your authority with your audience on LinkedIn. It's like repurposing. It's getting more value out of the content you're making. But for podcasters that are doing that, and that's the only thing that they're doing to grow, just in terms of downloads, then as you've demonstrated, it might not be the best thing to do, especially if it's just a kind of AI set it and forget it type thing.
That's it. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you've got time, I'll just ask you one more quick question around your podcast and the two of you as podcasters. What have you got out of starting your podcast in terms of what it's done for your business and your brand and everything?
Great question. I think it's helped us out tremendously when it comes to just even monetization. Like, I think our intention with the podcast was more so to build our authority, to provide genuinely transparent content about how we grow shows, how it works, for podcasters and entrepreneurs who might not be able to afford our service right at this very moment, but want to have a foot into our door. Those were like the intentions of it, really, to be honest with you. Now, there are tons of bonuses that came alongside that we didn't intend for. Like, our intention wasn't ever to monetize the podcast straight away. We knew we were always going to monetize it when we build up the audience. But so far this year, we've generated, 5 figures plus each month from the show. We've been able to use it as a massive lead nurturing tool for our business, meaning someone who's comes in, let's say, from a different source like Facebook ads or cold email, and then we send them to our podcast, and before you know it, 4 episodes in, they now come into a sales call and they're very warmed up. They understand our philosophy. We've educated them. I'm not now having to educate them on a sales call. I say myself or our team. So there's been so many side consequences when it comes to nurturing the right people, engaging our audience, getting tons of feedback, and building a proper ecosystem that quickly turns a cold lead into a warm and hot prospect. That has been huge for us.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, both of you, for coming on. There's so much useful insights for podcasters to take away. I know there's a couple of things that I'm thinking of around my podcast based on what we've talked about. So I think everyone hopefully is coming away with at least one thing that they can think about. Am I doing that? Is there a way that I can improve that and grow my show faster? So thank you again. So if there was one place that you'd like people to visit after this episode, if they want to learn more about how to grow their podcast, where should they go?
Well, the main place would be our own podcast. It's called Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. Of course, you can find it, anywhere you listen. And then if you are more interested in our services and how we might be able to help you grow, or just find out a little bit more about us, you can just visit our website, getmorelisteners.com. Sorry, that was 2.
That's cool. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks again, Taig and Anthony. And speak again soon.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Cheers, John.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.